So this is the final painting. I was going for a little bit of a contrast between the futuristic and kind of the old world. This guy's traveling on a camel while there's, futuristic flying cars in a distance. In this, I wanted to make it feel, otherworldly. So these stylized structures contrasting the old world as well. So let's take a look at how this was put together. First step was the value sketch. So this is how I started. I blocked in with 3 or 4 values. Not too many values here. You can see this is very graphic to represent, a guy on a camel. I blocked in what kind of shapes I wanted to see. Now this is obviously, it gets refined, but just a general shape language of what I wanted the structures to look like. And the general lighting direction, so I wanted the light to come in and hit these side faces here all along. And I wanted, distant mountains to go far back in the distance, so we have, a play on values going from dark, to light all the way through for that atmospheric perspective. So once I lay in, my general direction, the compositional elements, a little bit of the shape design that can possibly, drive the look of the structure, just the basis. It's not going to be a final, but it's just to throw down ideas. We go in and take a look at photo reference. So this is a photo reference I found that was kind of close to the amount of atmosphere I wanted as it recedes, the time of day and the lighting direction. So the light's coming down, hitting the side faces, and then cast the other faces in the shadow. So that's another thing I was looking for. I wanted a nice sandy terrain, so sand going back in the distance. The scale was what I was looking for as well, the scale of the rocks and the scale of the world, although I accentuated it. But I liked how, these shapes were lit and in shadow. So we get, this is top light. So if this structure was a lot larger, it would get that side light, and then the rest cast in shadow. You can see back here as well. And that's going into a little bit of analyzing, so we'll take a look at that a little bit later. But once I found that reference that was kind of close to what I had in mind for this painting, I wasn't happy with the color, so I tweaked the color a little bit to add a little bit more of a color design to it. I wanted the warms to contrast the cools of the shadow and the cool of the sky, so we have a nice complementary a warm cool play in the color. And you can see I turned up the contrast on this side just to get a little bit more pop into the image. You can see if I just turn on my value, I added a little bit more contrast to it. And I didn't make this up. I also looked at other reference images that gave me this idea. I wasn't just knocking it down for no reason, because if you do that, it knocks it out of the lighting ballpark that this image is in. So make sure, I found another image that was close to this that had the same lighting direction and atmospheric value, but that image had this. Now depending on the photographer and how they shoot it, that also depends. So I found that image to be a little bit more appealing to me, and this element in the side was a little contrastier, so I went with a little bit more of a contrast look. Adds a little bit more pop to it. And you see the color tweak. So once I have this, I have my color information, I have my lighting information, I have my value information. This gives me a huge head start into what I'm going to apply to my painting. So the next step we're going to take is to go into this reference image and really break it down and find the essential elements that are going to make my painting realistic based on this. So we're going to dive into that, and then we're going to go into the final painting that I showed you and all the layers that I used to get this image here. Alright, so let's go take a look at our reference image and start to analyze some of the key points in this that we can apply to our painting. So first thing I do is I start with the sky, and I'm just going to create a new layer here so I can paint on. So we take a look, and the lighting directions coming in from screen right, coming in, hitting this face, and we have a shadow on this side. We have to pay attention to, let's look at the value. So I have my hue and saturation at the top set to color mode so it doesn't affect my values, and I usually lock that layer so I can't select it. So let's look at the values. So first thing we notice is that it's lighter at the horizon, and it slowly gradates to a darker top. Now if you imagine this being a sphere mapped onto a sphere and it's going away from us, the top there is going to be the sky that's above our heads. That's why it's getting darker. So horizon is going to be a lot lighter, and it gradates to the value up here that's a lot darker. Now if you notice, there's another gradation from here to here, closer to the light source. So we can see that this area closer to the light source a lot lighter than back here. That's another thing we're going to pay attention to. And we want to also make sure that we're paying attention to the gradient that's in the sky from, again, from the top, from the bottom straight up to the top. This gradient is different than this gradient because the value at the top of the sky is getting darker. So that's something we want to implement into our sky. Let's take a look at the color. So we notice that the horizon is a lot warmer, and that's because there's more atmosphere and dust that's causing that to be a lot warmer here. As you can see, it starts to really cool down as you go higher into this nice blue. So that's something we want to implement. The horizon line is going to be warmer, starts going to a little bit more of a cyan, a little bluer, and then we get into a little purpley blue almost in here. And again, we see the same gradation of color from here straight up. So it's a little warmer near the horizon line, and then it starts cooling down as it gets to the top, but still not as cool as over here in this far side of the sky. So these kind of gradations is what we want to pay attention to. So that is analyzing the sky. Those are the essential elements for this sky. And another thing I like to do to make my analyzing maybe a little bit easier sometimes is just duplicate that layer and throw on noise, dust, and scratches just to eliminate a lot of the unnecessary details. That's going to make our job a little harder. We still retain the detail in there, but it just softens it down so that we can analyze it a little better. So let's take a look at this mountain here, this rock formation. Let's go back to our values and start analyzing this. So first thing we notice, obviously, the light side and the dark side. So we have light hitting these faces and then the shadowed area. But one thing we want to pay attention to is the value of that light compared to the value of the dark, the shadow. That's something that's going to be very important to implement into our painting. Again, the value of the light compared to the value of the dark. That's the contrast. Another thing we want to pay attention to is the amount of bounce light that's happening. So this face technically is not getting hit by light, but it's a lot lighter than this face here. And that's because there's a lot of bounce coming in from these faces, from the ground, and causing it to be lifted. So that's something we want to pay attention to, our bounce light. You look at those faces around here, these areas, and the shadows are going to be a lot lighter here too than the shadowed area here. There's just not another surface here that's allowing light to bounce back onto it. So that's another thing we want to think about. So key light value versus the shadow value, the bounce light that's happening, and that value between the light and the bounce light we want to pay attention to. And then we want to look at also the atmospheric light that's coming in here. A little bit of that fill. You can notice that the bottom of this is darker than the top. And that's just more atmospheric light. Maybe there's actually another object here that's bouncing light into it, but it's reflecting what's out there, the sky that the face is facing. And it's causing that to be a lot lighter than the bottom, where it's not reflecting anything and there isn't as much bounce. There is bounce, however, up in here, in this face. As you can see, this is lighter than this value. So that's something we want to take note of too. As the surfaces that are closer to the bottom, that have a light face right underneath it, they're going to bounce light back into these surfaces. And it's subtle, but that subtlety is what's going to make your painting look real. So again, the bounce light value up in the top surfaces, they're a lot lighter than the bottom surfaces. And that's more atmospheric light and reflection that's happening there. So once we've analyzed the value of it and we have an understanding of the value of this element, we can then go and tweak our color, because the value should never change. As long as you're affecting the color on a color mode like this, color balance, and I put this on color mode, it should not affect, it will not affect the value. So you can see I can push and pull all these tones and nothing gets affected the value. Now if we put this on normal mode, and we start pushing those values, pushing that around, and let's just keep it to this area. So you can see the difference. What's happening is that it's changing the value. So, and that messes up what we had set up originally to try to match. So we always put that on color mode. So once we put our color correction on color mode, we can start tweaking and color correcting it to match our element to the photo reference. So the color of the light, this nice warm, and I'll just use the color picker here. A nice warm compared to a lot cooler shadow. So that's what we want to pay attention to. And notice the differences in color versus this surface against that surface. It's in the same family, just different value and different saturation. Notice the difference between the light and the shadow. It's bounced, so it's a lot lighter value than the deep purpley magenta that we have here. It's warmer, relatively warmer, and a lot lighter in value. So this is what we want to pay attention to color-wise. The color of the light, the bounce, the darks. These are the three cues that we want to hit. I erased that by accident. The next thing we want to pay attention to is the contrasts, and we can go into our hue and saturation here to help us. And we're going to turn off our noise node there so we can pay attention to this a little better. If you notice the contrast between the light and dark versus if we were looking at this element, the value of the light and dark here. This is the contrast, and this is also what's going to help atmospheric perspective. this looks a lot closer than this element because of the contrast between the light and dark here. Between this and this value. How much detail do we see in the shadow area of this element versus the shadow area of here? You see it's almost a flat color compared to the amount of detail we see there. So that's another thing that we want to pay attention to. Contrast, the value contrast in the shadow area, and the contrast between the light and the dark that we talked about before, and the contrast between the light and dark also in the light side. This is the light side getting hit. What's the value of that between those two? You see less contrast, more contrast. Those contrasts are very important. We want to pay attention to that as much as we can. And also the value and the amount of detail that's in the bounce light. You can see there's more detail here, where if we look at this element, a lot less detail. You can see the detail. This is a dark shape, but notice the difference between the darks in the shadow side versus the value difference between the darks and the value side here. A lot deeper, a lot more contrast. And that's something we want to pay attention to, even on the bounce side. What is the value between this dark shape and the bounced and the bounced light surface? So this is bouncing and this is still kept in shadow, but look at the contrast difference. You want to pay attention to those things. So that's contrast. Also, we're going to take a look at our edges. So if I took a look at this edge here, right along here, look at the difference between the sharpness of that edge compared to the sharpness of that edge. Something that's a little further in the distance. Notice how this is a lot crispier and sharper, and this is a lot softer. And that's because of light wrap. As this goes further back into the distance there, we have more light affecting the edges than we have here, keeping the edges sharper here compared to something far back in the distance. So that's something we're going to implement into our paintings. I see a lot of matte paintings with super crisp edges. If I just sample this, they're super sharp back here. You know, notice the difference in the edge quality now that I picked a hard brush and I painted it. You can really see the softness of that edge compared to the one I painted with a hard brush. And I see a lot of people's paintings having this cutout feel, and that's something we try to avoid. And that's by just analyzing this photo, is saying, okay, the edges are a lot softer as they go back. There's more light wrap, there's more atmosphere affecting it. The edges just get a lot softer than something that's closer in the foreground. Notice how the sharpness of that edge compared to this edge. So you see how even within the same structure, this is closer to us than this edge, so it's going to be sharper than something that's further back. So edge quality and hard and soft edges. So now that we took a look at that, we can also take a look at how it blends into the element. But this is not an essential this is not an essential lighting element that we're concentrating on. This is something that once we start painting, we can start paying attention to it. Another actually very important thing that I forgot to mention is the shadow quality. The sharpness of that shadow. You notice that it gets darker near the bottom crevices, if we look at the value, and then lighter as there's more bouncing into these surfaces and lifting those darker crevices up. Notice the sharpness of that edge right there. That's called edge quality in the shadow. You can see how sharp the edges of the shadow are in there as well, compared to something that's a little bit softer. If we can find a shadow being cast here on the ground, you see how much softer that edge is than the sharp crispiness of this. So the same edge quality that gets affected, and that's something else that we want to pay attention to and apply to our painting. So let's take a look at more distant elements that fall into more atmosphere. This is something that we're also going to apply to our painting. Let's look at the values. So we're looking at the amount of detail and contrast that's in this. Notice how the lighter areas, so I just don't want to paint on that layer. Notice the contrast between the lighter areas and the darker areas. A lot more subtle. And that is what we want to pay attention to, is the difference between the light and the dark, and apply that to our painting, because that sets it back into perspective, atmospheric perspective, and gives our scene that sense of depth that it needs and that realism. Look at the amount of detail we see in the shadow side compared to the amount of detail that we see in this shadow side. So that also is a cue to how much atmosphere is affecting this and how far back it is in space. That adds to the realism. I see a lot of people just knock it back, and I'm just going to create a new layer and paint and see so you guys know what I'm talking about. They'll do something like this. Well, that doesn't really work. It's not very realistic. It may work in some circumstances, but this is definitely not realistic. The eye can see a lot of detail. If you ever go out and you're standing, if you're in front of the Grand Canyon and you're looking out way far in the distance with so much atmosphere, but you can still see, your eye picks up even the subtlest amount of value change in detail. And that's pretty much what we're talking about here, is being aware of the amount of detail that we see, even in things that are really far back in space and have atmosphere affecting it. So let's pay attention to the contrast in the detail level, the contrast being the value of the light to the dark and the amount of detail that we see, which is driven by that contrast. And you can see the contrast and the amount of detail recedes as we go further back. You can see in this shadow area we're barely seeing anything, the amount of detail in here, versus look at all that detail we can see in the shadow side in this closer element. So we want to pay attention to that. Also pay attention to, again, the edge quality. Look how soft that edge is. Again, I see a lot of people doing super hard edges, and I'm also a violation of that problem, is that sometimes I let my edges get too sharp. You have to really pay attention to that. Look at this. Look at that soft edge compared to this edge here. You can see this edge is a lot sharper than this edge, but this edge is a lot softer than something that's closer, that edge. So edge quality, level of detail, and contrast, essential elements for something that's affected by atmosphere. So if we were to sell this piece in our painting, if we focused on those three elements, we're good to go. Value, contrast, and edge detail. Or sorry, edge quality. So if we take a look at this element here, we can see that the contrast and the amount of detail has gone down from this element as it goes further back into space here. And the value between the light and dark has gone down. The contrast again between the dark crevices and the shadow side has lessened since from this element, and the edges have gotten a little softer. In some areas it remains hard, then something here, so that's something we want to pay attention to. Some areas we can use a harder edge, and that's because the contrast between these two elements has increased from these two. So that's another thing we want to keep in mind, is the values between elements as they go further back. And if we are using this element to drive our painting, we can apply the same value structure as it goes away from this element to this element. It goes further back to this, and it goes further back to distance. So we want to duplicate the value structure here. And as we go really far back, we notice that detail has really dropped in the shadow area compared to this. The contrast between light and dark is a lot less in here, and the value has greatly changed between the two. And again, the edge quality a lot softer. So all those cues we're going to apply to our painting as we go from this element further back into maybe this element, and finally in the distance. And we're going to apply the same principles that we talked about, elements from this reference image here into this element here. The value of the light into our value of the light. The value of the shadow into the value of our shadow. And we may want some bounce up in this surfaces into this area, and maybe even up top, get the same amount of reflection and atmospheric light that's affecting it, and raising the value there will apply to this. And bounce light, if we have, don't think we'll have much bounce light in here, but maybe this type of surface, if we get an element that has a little bit of light here, that surface, this bounce surface, may be lighter than the shadow. And the same thing applies for this. We may take this as a starting point and add on to it. Now this has light, so we may look for other elements that are in the same lighting condition with the same or close to the amount of atmosphere we want, and take a look at how that affects it. By no means is this the only reference image I use. This is a very good starting point, but if I'm looking for, well, how does an element that's lit with this lighting direction, but in this part of in space with that amount of atmosphere, how does the light look on that? Now we have a cue here, the difference, and we can use that value to drive the light in this element here, and take the value of the shadow to use the value shadow. Or we can take a look at another reference that's similar, and it's much larger, and see how atmospheric perspective affects that, and the intensity of the light and shadow affects it as well. So this is just one example. I used multiple, as you'll see when we analyze the actual painting and go through the layers. But this definitely gives us a very, it takes us about 75 to 80% of our painting. So let's take a look at the ground, which is the final piece, and it has similar cues. We're always looking at the value of the sand compared to the value of the sky. And if we put on our dust and scratches again, but this time really blast it, whoops, to get rid of a lot of the detail, we can see now the value of the sand here compared to the value of the sky. So the darkest value of the sky up here compared to the dark value in the sand. We want to duplicate that relationship, the exposure, into our painting. Same thing goes for the value of the shadow in these bushes on the ground. Look at that, the black level intensity compared to some of the bigger structures, and look at how it recedes into the distance. You can see the black levels in the distance. You can see the gradual change, darker to lighter, darker to lighter, more of an intense. We'll pick it so we can see that, see what it's really doing here. The value of something closer, the value of something further back. See it just getting darker and darker. Look how intense it is there compared to something in the distance. So that's the black levels, and I want to make sure my black levels have a slow transition as it gets lighter in value as it goes further away. And you can see how light it really gets back here. Where we want to implement some of this actual nice detail in the sand as well, although that's not an essential element. The essential element is the value of it and the value of the black levels of the shrubs that are on the sand. And we can look at the color and how it transitions. If we use this again, look at that gradual change of color. If we just sample it, this is a foreground piece, and then the shadow area of that sand gets a lot cooler, and then look at the value of the light value in the sand compared to the foreground. You see the saturation shift. It loses saturation as it goes further into the distance, because more atmosphere and dust in the air is affecting that color. So we want to be aware of that as well. We didn't talk about color actually in these elements, but you can see, you know, the value, or the color of the light in this element compared to the color of this. Now they're of the exact same rock. If the atmosphere was lifted and this was a complete 100% clear day, you would probably get the exact same colors if there was no atmosphere involved, at least similar color and value. So we want to pay attention to the color of the light as well that's in an element that's further back and affected by atmosphere and dust, and look at the value, the color of the shadow as well compared to the color of the shadow here. Darker, more saturated, and it gets lighter and more desaturated as it goes further back. And you can see how it jumps. So let's pay attention to not only the value but the color. The color shifts as well from something far back, that's the light color, versus the light color here. Something else we want to pay attention to and apply in our painting. So we've analyzed our reference image. We've gathered a crap ton of information that we can now apply and take on our painting with confidence, knowing that what we're applying to our painting is going to be based in reality. It's going to be realistic and have a realistic feel. And once we get into that space where we've applied the information we've learned into our painting, we can then push it to a certain degree to take it into a hyper-real or more of a fantastical lighting design. And you'll see what I mean by that. So we don't have to stick to it one-to-one. We can use the same value relationships and color relationships, but we can push saturation, we can push the contrast a little bit, but keep the same value relationships, but push the contrast and bring this into a little bit more of a hyper-real environment and make it a little bit more fantastical. And that's what we're gonna talk about as we look at the painting and break down all the layers and see how this final painting comes together. Alright, so let's take a look at how this painting came to be by looking at the PSD, going through the layers. So here's the painting here, and I have my reference image up top so I can always refer to it. Now in this painting, you saw that I added some ships here to give it a little bit more of a contrast between futuristic and old world. So I'll turn that off for now. We'll get into it a little bit later. If we take a look at this, the painting, turn on our hue and saturation here to check our values, you can see that I kept it very close to the reference photography. Now you can see a little bit more contrast in this area than what I have, and I wanted a little bit more dust and atmosphere in the air, so I took it down, but still pretty close. And back here, similar to what we have going on over here, sky, and the sand. Now this is, and obviously the color, we match the color. Now this is essential to bringing a level of polish and realism and believability to your matte paintings. You can see I made it a little bit more fantastical by having these massive structures, but it was still based on the real world value, color, and contrast that I saw in the reference photography. So very important to stick to that. Now let's take a look at this. So I'm going to take off the characters and that rock there, and you can see that I have my sand brought in from the reference photography, reference photo that I found, very similar to this. And what I liked about this image is that it had tracks of I'm guessing a car that went through here, but in our situation we have this nice ellipse that I found that I wanted to use with the ship idea to kind of push that, you know, there's vehicles also on the ground as well as flying, so it kind of tied in this idea together. So I found that image, color corrected it to match or be similar to the color and value of our reference. Now the other thing I did was the original photography was like this, but instead what I wanted to do was break up this massive light shape with some shadow, just to give it a little bit more interest and knock down less important area, which is the foreground, not that one, and create more of a focal point for our character. So all that is a curve. Pull the curves here. A curve pulled down for value, and then I clipped on a color balance to push the color. You can see the color difference a lot warmer, and what we learned from analyzing our photo is that the shadow side, when even on a cast shadow, it's a lot cooler from the skylight. So we cooled that down a little bit. And then I added just a little bit more of a gradation to add a little bit more realism to it. And that was just by duplicating the same thing, controlling the opacity, pulling it down, and painting in exactly where I wanted it to be in the clipping mask. So that was our sand. Next thing we did was go into the sky. And the sky was essentially an element that a friend of mine actually shot in, I believe, Israel. And it had the same value structure. I graded this a little bit down to match our photo reference. Lighter on the lit side and a darker, bluer, more saturated color on the part of the sky that's going away from us and up top. So same thing. And again, this is grading the clouds a little bit darker to match, and then brightening up the brighter side and accentuate a little bit. I believe I added a bloom to this as well. Yeah, there's the bloom if I took that out. And you can see we're getting pretty close to our reference. So pretty simple stuff there, and we blocked in our sand and sky already. So we can now take a look at the real meat of this. And let's take a look at this structure here and how it came to be. So that is left rock. So our base element was, I'm going to take a look at the reference images, was this element here. I really liked the element. It's got the same light direction coming in that we wanted. It's got the lit side and the shadow side, and it gave me a nice base to create a structure on top of. So what I did is I masked this out exactly the same way, high contrast, matte, pulled it out, brought it over, and the element looked like this. Masked it in, moved it into position of where I wanted it to be according to my sketch that I had already laid out compositionally. And of course, more detail in this one than there was in my sketch blocking, but that sketch blocking was just to show big shapes and blocking composition and lighting direction. So once I have my element, I then start to color correct it to get it into this ballpark. And that's going to take, let's go through this. Actually, I might have to turn off this as the extension. Let's take a look at the color corrects. So grade it down to make sure the value was in the same ballpark. The next thing I did was make sure the detail level was the same that I was seeing up in the reference. So that's another color correct curve here, and I like to keep them all separate and clipped onto it so that I can come back anytime and change it around if I need to. It's non-destructive. So I turn that on and I knock down the contrast by just pulling the lights down and lifting the blacks to make it less contrasty. The next thing I did was the value, the intensity of that light was not the same as I saw in the reference. This was really bright. So I want to match that by adding a separate curve, knocking down the brightness, lifting up the blacks, and then doing a little bit of color. I did this one in the same curve just to save on multiple color corrects, but I noticed that the color up here was a lot warmer than I had, so I had to warm it up. Then I go into color corrections. And you can see, because I've established my values now, I don't want to mess with my values anymore. So I set my color blend mode on my color balance to color correct, and that's going to affect only the color, not the values. And I want it to go first into the shadows and affect just the shadows. We're going to get to the light in a minute. So we color corrected it to match that. Then we do hue and saturation. Saturation was off. I want to focus on the saturation of that color compared to what I had. Oh, that was the saturation in the sand that was in the element that I wanted to have a nice blend. It was a little too saturated, and I want to make sure that it's close to the plate. So I knocked that down, and these are all with masks, so it's affecting only that area. You can see certain ones have clipping masks painted into it to affect only certain areas. Then I started to get into my light, and that light is pretty much duplicating the same element like I showed you guys in last week's class, was duplicating it, making a high contrast, and screening it on so that only the light values come through and not the darks. That's what that screening and making the high contrast does. And fixing the opacity to have the right intensity to match the contrast that we have. Next thing I did was just add a base to it. That's a separate element to help it integrate into the sand a little better. We don't want this hard cutoff. We want a nice kind of transition from a big, large rock structure down to more of a sandier area and less of a hard rock. And that's what we want to implement. The same natural occurrences that we're seeing in the reference into our images. You see how it doesn't look so natural if I just were to use that element? Now, in the reference, we see a little bit more of that, and you could say, well, you know, the reference in this one is working perfectly fine. Well, that's perfect. You can use that as well. It's not going to be the end-all be-all, but I like the way how natural this feels, and I want to apply the same thing. So it's grabbing an element that has a little bit more earthy transition to it, and blending it in, just painting it in. You can see how dirty and rough that is because they're both rocks and color corrected to be the same. There's a seamless transition. And this pass is the bounce light. This nice magenta bounce. We want to have that in there, and that's just with a separate layer on normal mode and color correct it to have a magenta feel and paint it in only on the top surfaces here, mimicking exactly what we see up there. So that's the left side. Now, of course, we want to extend it to what we had in our sketch, and that's the extension. Let's take a look how that's done. Same deal. I used this element here, matted it out, grabbed it, brought it in, and this needs a lot of color correction because of the contrast. We want to match again the contrast, the color, the bounce light that's happening. The bounce light, you see how I was talking about this. If I left that as is, you can see not quite working, not quite natural. Doesn't have that same realistic look to it than if I was to grab this layer, and it's just the exact same layer taken up and set on 25% and painted into the areas that I needed it. Just brings another level of realism to the work. And the light side, same thing. Duplicate the base, make a high contrast version of it, and screen it on, and turn down the opacity and paint it in where I wanted that light to hit, and fixing value and color there. And lastly, I think I was fixing some edge detail, edge quality there. Not sure, these are probably some hand painted elements just to break it up. You can see it needed a little bit of breakup, so I just cloned around some more detail. And this layer here is actually that fill atmospheric light that we were talking about, just to help it sit in that environment a little better. And that was just by sampling a color from the sky and taking a soft brush and just painting it in very subtly, adding a little bit of atmosphere to really help it sit into that environment. Again, a cue that we picked up from studying and analyzing a reference image. So that right there is that element, and I believe I added some dust to this as well, and I got that idea from this image that we used for the right side of it. You see that dust layer right at the bottom adds a little bit of depth and separation. That's where I got that idea from, and that's by using, you know, other reference images too. We can pull ideas and apply it to our painting, and that's what I did with that dust layer right there. And that's that side right there. You can see how easy it becomes when we have a solid understanding of what is happening in the reference image. So that analyzing step that we talked about, very, very important, because I'm no longer second guessing. I'm not going back and forth. I analyzed it. I know exactly what it's going to take to make it look real by extracting those essential elements and applying the same principles to my painting. Let's take a look at the right side here. So that is BG Rock, I believe. Yes. All right, BG Rock. So taking this element here and bringing it in, I masked it out, brought it in with a nice clean alpha, cleaned it up, and placed it in here. Now this is going to take a lot of color correction to put it back into our color space that we want. That's actually what I'm looking for, is the extension. And this is how important it is to name your stuff so you can find it. So there's the element by itself. And again, value structure, applying a very similar value structure to here. And we also, because this reference is close to the value structure and atmosphere that we have in our sketch and in our reference photo, we can use the light value and the dark value as a guide to relight our element to fit our lighting direction in our sketch. So there again, we used multiple reference images that were similar in nature and lighting direction and value structure together to combine and put it into our painting. Let's go and take a look at some other things I did. So fixing the values, making it a lot more decontrasted than it was when I pulled it in, affecting the color, correcting it on color mode because we don't want to affect the value structure anymore, and I believe just a little bit more softening of that edge with a little bit more dust and atmosphere in the air. You see how harsh that line is, how sharp it is, and then we just soften it out with a little bit of dust and atmosphere in the air. And then the light. So without that, I'm first concentrating on the shadow side, because the light I'm going to put on after. So I want to hit the value of the color and the color of the shadow side, and then duplicate this layer, make a high contrast, put it on screen mode, fix the opacity to the intensity I want, and then paint in my light where I want it to be. And then that's a little bit of hand painting there, just to add a little bit more detail, a little bit more light detail. And you can do that because this image is really large. We're going to scale it down so we can do a little bit of hand painting. This is fixing the value of the sand that was in the plate. Again, value and then color, and adding some dust to it to add a little bit more atmosphere to the element. And I'm not sure what that layer is doing. So there, I blocked that in. And another thing I did was, you can see that part, that rock structure in the reference is this rock structure, and I wanted to be able to control it separately. So I cut it out, be able to push it further back in the distance to match the distance that was in here. Now I pushed it a little further back than this one, and that was just to get a little bit more separation between the two, to really add some distance. So we can play around with it as well. But you can see I kept the same essential elements that I analyzed in this, the level of contrast, the intensity of the light, the color of the light versus the shadow, and edge quality, and I applied it to this image, to this element in here. Color of the light, color of the shadow, intensity of the light, intensity of the shadow, and edge quality. So that's what I've done here. And what I did with this is the light wrap. I wanted to soften out those edges. So like the last week's class, I showed you guys how to do light wrap. I duplicated the sky, I flattened it out, and if I turn it off, you can see. And I just take a soft brush and I paint in where those edges are to soften them out a little bit. So that is my distant rock. So now let's go and look at the extension. So this is the extension. I wanted a little bit more of a otherworldly feel. The same thing I did with this. I wanted large structures jutting out of the ground, and what I used was that's the element right there. Cut it out, brought it in, painted in where I wanted this thing to be based on my sketch again, played around with the shape and the edges, color corrected it so that, again, it fit into the value structure that we analyzed here. So pulling down the lights, pulling up the blacks to de-contrast it, and then I have my color, separate layer, color correcting the shadows, because I'm going to apply the light again separately like we did for the other elements. And let's see where that light is. There you go. You can see some bounce. I'm fixing the bounce light in there a little bit. That's the light layer. Pull down the saturation and fix the color to match what I had underneath in the bottom element, and a little bit of that same atmospheric fill light affecting, you can see right here. Let's just sample it and see what's going on. You can see how it's affecting it. So we want to add a little bit of that to help it sit into the scene a little bit. So same deal there. The amount of detail that we see in the shadow side and the contrast to the amount of detail we see in the contrast in the reference. Now, again with the light wrap, I duplicate my sky and flatten it out. You can see where it's affecting it. You can see some of these edges here that I soften out. Just softening out those edges and just painting in very subtly with a soft brush to help those edges sit a little better. Same thing here. So not so sharp. And that's called light wrap. That's what we're talking about, the edge quality. You want to make sure you can see it really back here, really far back. I want to really blur those edges so that it's not so harsh and sharp. We talked about the foreground shadow. There's a little bit of bloom. Painted shadow cast by something, by this structure here, or maybe something that's out of the frame. A little bit of paint to fix that edge. You can see it was super straight, so I just took my clone brush and just cloned in a little bit of that detail just to break up that edge a little bit. We talked about the extension, light wrap, and midground rock. So I felt like there was something missing, and this was also in our sketch. We don't want a big, big space without breaking it up. The shadow definitely helped break it up, and I want to add a little bit something else to break up that space as well. And that was taking another reference image, the rock, essentially like that, bringing it in, cleaning it up, color correcting the same way, making sure our black levels are not are darker than the stuff in the background, and if we had something in the foreground, we would have a transition from darker to less dark to less dark as the black levels recede and get lighter as they go back in a different distance, as we observed up here in the reference image. And same thing again with the light on a separate layer. We did the bounce light on the bottom, very subtle, but it makes a difference. You can see it there. You can see how black that was, and I just put in a little bit of bounce there. You can see, and that was just sampling a value, brightening it up, and painting it in. There's the dust to help it sit in there, and a little bit bush. I added a little bush there, just for fun. And the other thing I want to say is painting in integration, making sure that the sand is integrated into our rock. So you can do that, wind is sweeping up sand into this rock, and it really helps integrate the element into our sand plate there. So that's another big thing there. We throw the dust on top, and it becomes nice and tidy, and it sits there very comfortably. So that's the midground rock. Characters, again grabbing from a reference image again that I found, a camel with the same lighting direction, and kept some of the sand and shadow in there, and just painted out what I didn't want from the image. Same way I showed you guys last week. And finally, the ships. So I wanted to add a little bit more of a futuristic kind of feel to this. So take a look at the ships here. And what I did for this was kind of interesting. Was I grabbed Googled chrome car and found a chrome car, cleaned out the tires and everything that made it look like a car, and shaped it, painted in this bounce light, this reflection, sorry, from the sand, reflection color of the sky right above it, and a glint because it's super shiny and the light's hitting it, and painted in. There's the ground ships. Painted in some dust, a dust trail. These things are going super fast and kicking up some dust, and some a little bit more of a little trail of whatever coming out of that ship to give it a little bit more of a speed. And I put a little motion blur on it so that it looks like it's really traveling fast. So that was that. And for the top ones, just painted shapes, nothing too crazy. I could have gone a little bit more detail, but I didn't want to take it any further than this. And it's just shapes painted in, color corrected, nothing crazy. But they were painted with perspective in mind. So you always want to make sure you have the right perspective, and that's just taking the line tool and creating a perspective grid. And we'll go into creating really nice perspective grids next week when we talk about cityscape map painting. And there it is. Add a little bit of bloom for an extra effect of really bright light coming in to our scene. And we have our map painting. And you can see how it doesn't have to be too complicated if you have a solid understanding of the essential elements and a good reference photo that has the lighting, the color, values, and just a whole ton of information that we can pull from and apply to our map paintings. Now, it may take you a little while to color correct and things like that, but you have a goal of what you're ultimately want to make it look like, and that's the important part. Going down the tunnel blind in the dark is gonna take away from your believability and the realistic aspect of your painting, and you never want to do that. You want to have a solid reference image that you can pull the information out of and have a goal to hit. So that is very important. Again, let's take a look at the value structure. Very close. Black levels, as I was talking, receding, really dark, less dark, less dark, less dark, non-existent almost. But there you go. And final map painting with some tweaks. The final tweaks are, adding a curve into this and, brightening it up, darken it down, whatever you want to do. You can push and pull it as much as you want. Don't push it too much because then it becomes unrealistic. If I was to really go in here and, this isn't realistic anymore, Neither is this. You see, we've killed all that information that we pulled from the reference image. We've killed it. So make sure, you can push and pull, but don't push and pull to a point where it becomes unrealistic. You want to always set it in realism. So there you go. That's the final painting. Alright, so looking back, we started with a sketch and a value study to block in our composition, establish lighting direction, very loose. It doesn't have to be a very detailed sketch, but to block in the bare essentials that we need. Then we found reference that had similar lighting that we were thinking about. We took cues from it as far as lighting, value, atmosphere, and color that we wanted to apply to our painting, and we found elements that we can use in our painting and apply the information that we analyze into our painting. So we break it down to the essential elements. We understand why that photo looks the way it does, pulled out all the essential information from it, and applied it to our painting. Extract elements, block it in a composition, tweak the lighting with the photo reference, color correcting, adjusting contrasts, and then final tweaks to get our painting. So your assignment for this week is going to be to do something very similar. Looking back, what I want you guys to do is find a piece of reference that you like that has good lighting and color that you want to duplicate, and it doesn't have to be, you know, a massive elaborate map painting. Don't make it difficult for yourself. What we're looking for is to be able to analyze the photo and apply the information that we learned into our own photo. That's the point of the assignment and this exercise. So, you know, you can literally do, you know, if it's something like this, it doesn't have to be a super detailed map painting. You can just do, if I fill this in with black, or white, doesn't matter. You can do a painting like this and just do a study of either a mountain or a beach or anything really. Don't make it too complicated on yourself. Again, you don't have to go to a full extent like this. We just want to concentrate on pulling the essential elements out. So you can even do a painting like this, and if you want to change it around, you know, accentuate it like I did, you're more than welcome to do that. But I don't want you guys to go crazy with it and make it hard on yourselves. I want you guys to finish the painting, one, and to do it right. And if you're worried about completing a big painting, then you're gonna miss a lot of the point of this assignment. Now, if you have time and you want to do a big painting like this, you're more than welcome to. If you don't, focus on a simple photo or something. If I had, you know, an image reference like that, I'll pick one section and I'll focus just on this one section. That way I don't make it too difficult on myself. But I want you to analyze it. I want you to apply the same information to your map painting. And if you want, you can change it around a little bit, make it a little bit more fantastical. That's up to you. But I want to see the reference image, kind of like what I did here, on one page. So you're painting below your reference image that you're duplicating or you're pulling your information from up top, and so I can see how close you came to it and if you really understood pulling the essential elements out of the photo and applying it. So again, pick a photo reference that you like that has interesting lighting, interesting color maybe, or atmosphere. You don't have to make it too difficult. You can simplify an image if you only like part of it and duplicate that and pull the essential elements out and apply it to your painting. You can also accentuate your painting if you like. If you don't have time, don't worry about it, but I want to see the reference image and your painting on the same page. That's your assignment for this week. All the best. Apply all the things that we talked about: extracting elements, color correction, value, contrast, edge quality. Keep all that stuff in mind. And if you have to, review the class again to refresh your mind, or write down a list of the things we mentioned, so you're always looking back and making sure if you hit all those points. And all the best, good luck, and I'll see you next week.